see here. So again, this is going to be session one of a three-part series covering the first portion of the book. And this first series is covering the problem. What is the problem? And this is about the alcoholic illness. That's what we're going to want to cover here today. And the first thing we want to look at is we're talking about the alcoholic illness. I don't use those words just like coming out of my own head. That's what they call it in the book. They mention illness over and over and over. They never call alcoholism, if you will, in this book, a disease. It's never mentioned. I'm not saying it's not. All I'm saying is all we focus on is what's in the first portion of this book. So I'm going to cover what's in the first portion of this book. And again, if you even look just to verify this, I mean, it's all over the book, but if you just go to page, I think it's 18, right at the top of page 18, the authors write an illness of this sort, and then they put a hyphen because they want to reiterate what they just said. And we've come to believe it an illness, okay? They believe this to be an illness. The doctor calls it an illness. Over and over, it's an illness. So what is an illness? You know, we've learned to use in this meeting a dictionary so we don't come up with our own terminology and our own definitions for what words mean. We want to know the dictionary is the best source, right? And our authors knew that as well. And we'll see that as we move along. But an illness is defined by Webster's. And by the way, if you don't have this app, I got Webster's app on my phone. I've had it for a number of years. It costs $2.99 for a full year. And it is a wealth of knowledge. Every time I come across a new word in here, I go to it to look it up to see, you know, what the definition is. But anyhow, the definition of an illness is a condition that prevents the normal functioning of the mind and or body. A condition that prevents the normal functioning of the mind and or body. So why are they calling it an illness? Condition that prevents normal functioning of the mind and or body. Let's go and look at the forward to first edition. This is something that we normally do cover every week, and it's on XIII. It's only in about 5 pages, I think, from the front. It says forward to first edition at the top. In the first paragraph there, they say, we of Alcoholics Anonymous. And when they say this, we of Alcoholics Anonymous, we're not going to go into this right now into depth, but I can discuss this with you later. But when they're saying of Alcoholics Anonymous, they are not talking about the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, because when this book was written, there was no fellowship called Alcoholics Anonymous. The groups remained nameless for a while after this book was written. And then it says later, then they took the name after their book. So when this book was written, when they're saying we of Alcoholics Anonymous, they're saying we of this book. That's we who wrote this book. These are the authors, more than 100 men and women. And they say there are more than 100 men and women who have one thing in common. They have recovered. Recovered is defined as being returned to a normal state of health. They have recovered from what they say is a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. A seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. We're going to cover that in some different areas here, but an illness is a condition that prevents the normal functioning of the mind and or body. And they say they suffered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Kind of goes hand in hand. So that's what they're saying. And note that they say a seemingly hopeless. They didn't say it was hopeless. They said seemingly hopeless. So how does something turn out to seem to be hopeless? Does that not indicate that you must have tried not just some things, but if you're going to call something hopeless, you must have tried everything to make it work until you say, well, this is hopeless. That means I've tried everything. That's what they're stating. We've tried everything. And it seemed to us to be hopeless. The only reason I say seemed, because just a little bit before that, they said, but they recovered. We're going to get into how that happened next week. But I just want you to understand the difference there. Now, if we look at, you flip the page, one more page, and we go to forward to second edition. As I mentioned, this week we're covering the alcoholic illness, next, which is the problem. Next week we're going to be covering the solution, a spiritual experience. I want you to go down to the last paragraph in this forward to second edition. It says, the spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck in Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker, who was Bill Wilson, and an Akron physician named Dr. Bob Smith. 6 months earlier, before these guys met, it says a broker talking about Bill. This summarizes all of the first session and the second session that we're going to be doing. It says he had been relieved of his drink obsession. That's the problem. He had a drink obsession. He was relieved of it by what? A sudden spiritual experience, period. The problem and the solution is put together right there. But notice this, they said that they suffered from a condition of the mind and body. Now, Bills said that he was relieved of his drink obsession. Is an obsession in the mind or is an obsession in the body? Obsession is in the mind. We're going to come back to that thought and why that's so important. But I want you to keep that in mind. Now, the next thing we want to look at is, I want to look at step one, because that's really, when we get into the alcoholic illness, it's really about step one. And when we look at step one, on the wall behind me, it says, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, and they got a hyphen that our lives have become unmanageable. Hyphens indicating we got two different things going on here. And we're going to talk about these two different things because both of them have to do with this illness. But there are two different points here. And I can tell you, this has just came to me recently, maybe over the last year or so, the second part of this and how it really ties into the illness. Mostly, I've always looked at the mind and the body in the doctor's opinion, mind and body, mind. But that second part we're going to find is very key. But I'd also note that, you know, me playing around with AA from my teenage years for the first 10 years, bouncing in and out of AA, I got cute with a lot of these things. And you know, everybody, I'd have to be special, you know, and different. So, and everybody go around and introduce themselves and say, I'm an alcoholic. That doesn't say I got to be an alcoholic, does it? So my name's Gary, I'm powerless over alcohol. I'm not saying I'm an alcoholic. Doesn't say I got to be an alcoholic, do I? Anybody argue with that? Nobody could argue with that. I had no idea what I was talking about. Thought I did, but I'm going to show you the difference here. So I want to look at that. And I also want to, and I've mentioned this before, when you look at these 12 steps here, they come off of page 58 and 50, or I'm sorry, 59 and 60. There's no directions on here on how to do any of these. These are nothing more than really cliff notes. I challenge you to find a direction as to how to do any of this. How do you come to believe that a power greater than yourself could restore you to sanity? And what are you talking about saying? Are you indicating that I'm insane? That's kind of offensive, isn't it? What do you mean by that? And how do I do it? There's no directions. There's cliff notes. The directions we're told are in this book. So step one, that is, again, a cliff note. But what I want to point out is when they're talking about being powerless over alcohol, I want to now look in the book and see what the directions are for step one. And those directions, you would think they'd be on page one, wouldn't you? They're not. They bury it a little further in the book. You got to go to page 30 to find the directions for step one. And if you jump to page 30 and we look at the second paragraph, if you have an ink pen or highlighter, you might want to underline highlight this because these are the directions for step one. It says we learned, which is good. We got a textbook here because we're learning. It says we learned that we had, which is a must, we had to fully concede to our innermost selves we were alcoholic. This is the first step in recovery. What is the first step in recovery? We had to fully concede to our innermost selves we're alcoholic. Also, maybe when I was saying I was powerless over alcohol, maybe I didn't know what I was talking about. I didn't have the first step because it says here I have to concede that I'm an alcoholic. Well, why don't they say that up there? Why are they saying I got to admit that I'm powerless? And here it's saying I got to concede. By the way, concede and admit mean exactly the same thing. And note they are completely opposite, like 180 from accept. You may have heard people say before, I had to accept that I'm an alcoholic. That is not something we do. Look up the definition for accept. It's something we take and do freely and willingly. They tell us right at the top of page 30 here, most of us have been unwilling to admit we were real alcoholics. No person likes to think he's bodily and mentally different from us. That's not something, that doesn't sound like we're accepting anything, right? It's just we're beat into concession that this is probably the case, right? So to be powerless over alcohol, what's the difference between that and being an alcoholic? And that really ties into the new people here. Because if you want to know if you're an alcoholic, if you're coming to Alcoholics Anonymous and stand to reason, if you don't know anything else, you probably need to be an alcoholic, right? And they're telling us right here, the first step is to concede you are one. So here's the question. What is an alcoholic? Right? Not my opinion of what it is. Not what I hear 50 different people in AA meetings having their own opinion of what it is, but what these guys tell us exactly what an alcoholic is. So let's go into this and see what that is. If we turn now, they bury this a little deeper. If you go to page 44, they tell us what an alcoholic is. Page 44. Now we just, what did we just read? That we learned that we had to fully concede that we're an alcoholic. That's step one. So what that means is that I need to learn what an alcoholic is, right? In order to determine whether I'm one or not. That's the first sentence on 44 say. In the preceding chapters, you've learned, there's that word again, you've learned something of alcoholism. Where am I going to learn about alcoholism? Everything prior to page 44. That's going to be the doctor's opinion in the first 3 chapters. That's the only thing that's in those chapters, is to learn about alcoholism and what an alcoholic is. Okay? And they tell us that. It's not just me saying that, because I'm going to read you the next sentence. So you've learned a lot about alcoholism in all those chapters, it says. The next sentence says, we hope, if nothing else, we made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. That's the one thing they hope they've made clear there in those previous chapters. Who is and who isn't. And then they boil it down and they say it's just 2 questions you have to ask yourself. That's it. I know AA prints, does anybody know what it is now? Is it 50 or how many questions it is? They got little pamphlets about how many questions there are. Okay, all we know is what we need is in here. And it says there's only 2 you need to ask. Question 1 says, if when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, it says you're probably an alcoholic. That's it. And I want to pay attention to the words carefully. If when you honestly want to, think about the word honestly. What that means is I tried quitting and I honestly wanted to. I wanted to. Not the judge really wanted me to. My wife really wanted me to. My boss really wanted me to. No, I really wanted to. Does that ever happen? When I wanted to quit. And then it says, when you honestly wanted to, and then you found you could not quit entirely, indicating not only did you want to quit, but you tried to quit entirely. Not, I tried to quit for 3 months or a month until the heat got out my back. So you put all that together and put it in the form of a question to self, whether you're an alcoholic, it's like this. Have I ever tried quitting for good? I wanted to quit for good and failed. It's that simple. And it says, if that's the case, you're probably an alcoholic. Now, I want to pay attention to this next word. This took me a while to catch on to, because it doesn't say and, it says or, which means you only have to answer yes to one of these 2 questions, one or the other. Most of us can answer yes to both, but they're saying or. So the second question is, if when drinking, you have little control over the amount you take, then you're probably an alcoholic. So the question to self there is, reflect on your drinking career, right? And have you ever, during your drinking career, set out and said, you know what, tonight I'm only going to have 3 or 4, and that's it. Maybe 5, but definitely if it's over that, it's a problem, because that's all I'm having. I'm using my willpower, and that's it. And you wound up having much more than you intended to. Does that ever happen? Does that ever happen to anybody in here? Does that ever happen more than once with anybody in here? Has anybody ever found that like a way of life? Okay. Then that would be yes. So either one of those questions indicate that you're probably an alcoholic. It's that simple. And I always like looking in this book at what it doesn't say. Because I remember when I used to go to a lot of other meetings, we would sit and talk about the first step, and what really everybody would go around the table and start talking about when there's a new person there is the consequences we paid. So a lot of emphasis on the consequences. We're going to talk about the first step. Well, I lost my wife, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And what are we really telling a new person? We're saying that. We're saying, you know how we say, don't compare? But really what we're saying is compare. Because we're saying, I'm an alcoholic and this is why. Because I lost this, this, and that. But don't compare. But if you want to know if you're an alcoholic, what else are you going to do other than compare? Because I didn't tell you those things don't matter. I'm telling you that's all that matters. So when we're going around reflecting on our consequences, nothing to, do you see anything in there of consequences? Do you see anything in there that says how old you got to be an alcoholic? Or how much you got to drink, or how often you got to drink, or if you drink in the morning, or if you had the shakes, or you had the DTs, no, those could be earmarks, okay? And if you drink long enough, these things are sure to come to pass, but wherever you're at in the process doesn't really matter. It's those 2 questions that matter. Can you quit? And if not, you're probably an alcoholic. And if you can't control the amount you take, you're probably an alcoholic. That's it. That's it, step 1. So when you think about that, That's what it means to be an alcoholic. So now let's go back to what this says on step one. It says we're talking about being powerless over alcohol. Now reflect that back on those questions. If I try to quit for good and I can't, does that not indicate I'm powerless over alcohol? If I try controlling the amount I take and I can't control the amount I take, doesn't that indicate that I'm powerless over alcohol? They mean the same thing. If we're powerless over alcohol, we're alcoholic, period. They mean exactly the same thing. And then I'll go back to even the illness of the mind and body. And let's look at those two questions again. If I try to stop for good and find I can't, is that a condition of the mind or body? Well, if I'm trying to stop, what am I using? My willpower, my mind to stop. And I find I can't, right? When I try to control the amount that I take, I start having 1, 2, and then I end up having 20, and I wanted to stop at 3. Might not be easy to see right now because you might think that that's part of the mind, but as we dig into it, that's the body. This all goes hand in hand, and we're going to dig into that here in a second. But I also want to look at this. When they say that it was a seemingly hopeless state, really, when you look at step one, it can be boiled down to one word, and it's repeated over and over in the first portion of this book as well, and that is the word hopeless. While they say seemingly, you're going to see the word hopeless over. You know, when we get into the case studies, he conceded that his case was hopeless. We just see this over and over. Hopeless, by definition, it'd be good to know what that word means. If we're boiling down step one to the word hopeless, we should probably know what it means since they use it so much in here. Hopeless means no possibility of a solution, by definition, no possibility of a solution. So if you look at those two questions, is that really a hopeless state? Let's think about it. If I try to quit for good, I got all good reason for doing so, whatever it is, ultimatums, whatever, you want to quit for good, and you can't. That is not a hopeless condition if I can control the amount I take. If I can't stop for good, but every time I drink, I can have one. Is that a hopeless condition? How much trouble do you think I'm going to get into then? That's not a hopeless state. Now, if I can't control the amount I take, but I can stop for good, that's not a hopeless state either. Because if I don't ever pick it up, I don't have to worry about drinking too much. But when you put the two together, that's when we have a problem. When I can't quit and I get in, and every time that I start drinking, I have more than I intend to, and then I try quitting for good, and then I can't quit for good, and I start having a couple to make me feel better, and then I end up having more than I intend to, we spiral out of control. That's the hopeless condition. That's the hopeless condition that we all struggle with. Most of us, I don't want to say all, most of us struggle with before we get here. Not too many. I've met a couple, not too many people that said this was actually the first stop on the block. They got in a lot of trouble. They came to AA and that was it. Most people that I met, including myself, tried controlling it before we ended up taking it so seriously, like we're going to give it up. You know, we're going to try controlling the amount we take. We're going to try to whatever. We got to try to control it and find we can't. But putting the two together is a problem. So what this means is a couple of things. Number one is a couple of things that we do to try to control it. 3 things really that I've come to see it. One is we try to use our willpower. That's obviously number one, right? To stop or control. That's all about willpower. The other thing that happens is with us that start coming, well, let me just go to number 2 that usually happens is if we start having a problem with controlling it, then we start looking at avoiding temptation. And sometimes family members will help with that. Some of you may have heard that or experienced that before. They'll try to keep us away from alcohol, or we'll keep ourselves. I just need to stay away from it, stay away from people. They even say in the AA, stay away from wet places and wet faces. You guys ever hear that before? Maybe you hadn't. They said that a lot in the 80s and 90s. Stay away from wet places and wet faces. People used to drink with and where you used to drink at. That's called avoiding temptation. Okay. And then the next thing we do is maybe we come to AA and we start learning this stuff. And I start learning about this condition. And I start learning what's wrong with my mind. Then, and there's many case studies in this where people learn this from the AA guys. And the first thing they thought is, okay, now that I know what's wrong, all I got to do is keep on guard. If I can keep on guard and I watch for that lapse of mind, because now I got self-knowledge. Now I know what's wrong, the self-knowledge idea. So that's the 3 things we do. Now I want to look at the temptation idea here. I want to look at page 101 real quick. Because a lot of us try to do this. It's starting to get a little later in the morning, but I need my glasses now. I want to look at the second full paragraph. It says here, in our belief, and remember, this is the experience of more than 100 men and women. In our belief, any scheme of combating alcoholism, which proposes to shield the sick man from temptation, is doomed to failure. Any scheme. If the alcoholic tries to shield himself, he may succeed for a time, but he usually winds up in a bigger explosion than ever. We have tried these methods. These attempts to do the impossible have always failed. Get that? That's what happens when we try to avoid temptation. Now, willpower and self-knowledge, there's plenty of parts that we can look at that, but I want to look at a case study that points this out really well. And that's at the top of page 42. Actually, let's go to the bottom of page 41. Last paragraph on 41. This is part of a case study. And I'm just going to summarize what happened in this case study. This guy had a drinking problem, right? Wound up in a hospital. A couple of AA guys came to visit him. It says at the top of page 40, when they talked to him, says he was positive. Well, it actually says we told him at the very top, says we told him what we knew about alcoholism. And then goes on to say, but this is where the guy was at. He was positive that his humiliating experience being put in the treatment center, sanitarium, that humiliating experience plus the knowledge he had acquired from the AA guys would keep him sober for the rest of his life. Self-knowledge would fix it. Okay? So the guy went on like that. In Bill's story, he did the same thing. And then he got drunk. And then it goes on to say, I had every right to be self-confident. It would only be a matter of one, exercising my willpower, and two, keeping on guard. That's what he boiled it down to. That's what I got to do. And that's how I'm going to control this. This happens with a lot of people come to AA for a little while. They get this idea that keeping on guard and that their willpower and keeping on guard will do it from what they've learned in AA. Now I want to go to the last paragraph on page 41. This is after he drank. We don't need to go into him drinking. But it says, as soon as I regained my ability to think, see, because he had a very big drinking spout or spree, so he had to regain his ability to think. Then I carefully went over that evening in Washington. Notice that this is all in italics. Not only had I been off guard, I made no fight whatever against that first drink. None. This time I had not thought of the consequences at all. He goes down saying, it brought back what his alcoholic friends had told him, that they prophesized that if I had an alcoholic mind, this is the insanity of step 2, by the way, having an alcoholic mind. If I had an alcoholic mind, they told him the time and place would come when I would drink again. Don't know when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. They had said that though I did raise a defense, it would one day give way before some trivial reason for having a drink. Well, just that did happen, and more, for what I learned of alcoholism did not occur to me at all. Self-knowledge did nothing. I knew from that moment I had an alcoholic mind, and I saw that willpower and self-knowledge would not help in those strange mental blank spots. What do they mean by strange mental blank spots? We start digging into this a little further. Well, let's stop here. What was step 1? I got to concede I'm an alcoholic, right? Said you learned in the last 4 chapters what it was, but they already summarized it and said just ask 2 questions. So can't we just ask those 2 questions and move on to the next chapter? Why do we need to go back if they just summarize it? I answer yes, I move on. Why is that? Why? What we're going to find in those previous chapters is we're going to get the answer as to why both of those conditions exist. Why is it when I try to quit for good, I can't? Why is it when I try to control the amount I take, I can't? Why is that? If you don't know why that is, you're not going to understand it being a hopeless condition. You're just going to know that I can't. I don't know why I can't. And if you don't know why you can't, maybe in a year you're going to think, well, shoot, it's been a year since I've drank. I'm sure I can probably do it now, right? Why not? We need to know why if we're going to know what this idea of being hopeless is. And I want to show you the gravity of this. If you turn to page XVI, because learning what's in these first few chapters is of critical importance. And we're going to see this right from Bill and Bob in the very beginning. I want to drop down on XVI, drop down 8 lines from the top. And the first two words say next pages, period. And then it says that this, by the way, has to do with when Bill Wilson went to meet with Dr. Silkworth for the first time. It's where, and it says from the doctor, Bill had learned, why that word is in here a lot, isn't it? Learned? It's like we got a lot of learning. Bill had learned the grave nature of alcoholism. That's the first thing Bill had to do to recover. It goes on talking about the other things he did because they didn't have 12 steps. Can you believe when they wrote this book, they didn't, the first 100, believe it or not, they didn't work 12 steps. They had no idea there were 12 steps until Bill started writing chapter 5 and he decided to break it down into 12. They were actually doing 6 things. I'm not going to get into the thing, but you can read them on here: moral inventory, confession of personality defects. All of those things were necessary to recover. But the first one is actually right there where he had to learn the grave nature of alcoholism. Why was that important first? And I'm going to tell you what we're going to see here is Bill wouldn't have done those other things had he not knew that he was hopeless, had he not knew the grave nature of alcoholism. He would have found another way, because that is a dress. We're talking about changing our entire way of life, not just going through the work of steps 4 through 9 to recover, but changing our entire way of life. That's a pretty drastic proposal. You know, maybe if I can manage to go to AA and stay sober a couple of years, that's good enough. Maybe that'll work. They had to learn that that's not the case. And I'll show you if you go to the bottom of the page. After Bill recovered, first person he met with was who? Dr. Bob, who became the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous with Bill. So when Bill met with him, Bill told him what he knew of alcoholism, and he told him how he recovered. And he told him I was involved with, at that time, he was involved with what was called the Oxford groups, the groups that were practicing first century Christianity. And some of the tenets of that Oxford group, he put into practice these spiritual principles as a way of life, and he recovered. So he was telling Dr. Bob what he did and had a spiritual experience. And Dr. Bob was all hopeful in the beginning when Bill was telling about how he drank and what he knew. And Dr. Bob's like, you know about drinking, man. I am just like you. And you got over it. How did that happen? What did you do? And he told him. And as soon as he told him, Dr. Bob, his face just fell. It says here, because the physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but it failed. He tried living this spiritual way of life. You know how we know he tried? Not only that they say it here, but if you read into the history, Dr. Bob was part of the Oxford group in Akron, Ohio. So he already knew this stuff and tried putting them into practice, and he couldn't recover. So where is this rarely does a person fail? That's 50% failure right there between the two of them, right? So what happened? This is what happened. But when Bill gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, when he told him about the grave nature of alcohol, this is a hopeless condition, dude. There's no controlling it. You're going to die this way. That's what I've been told by this great Dr. Silkworth. When he told him that, that's when Dr. Bob began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness that he had never been before able to muster, and he sobered never to drink again to the moment of his death in 1950. He wasn't willing to do the work to the extent that he had to until he knew there was absolutely no other option available to him. And he learned that how? From Bill, but he didn't really learn it from Bill. Bill didn't say, I told him what I knew of it. He said, I gave him Dr. Silkworth. I told him exactly what Dr. Silkworth told me. And what Dr. Silkworth told me sank in. And it obviously sank in with Dr. Bob. And you know what? When they wrote this book, they said, we're not even going to paraphrase what Dr. Silkworth. We said, Dr. Silkworth, will you write this, what you told us? And that's why we have the doctor's opinion. Word for word, we're going to get exactly what Bill and Bob had learned about the grave nature of alcoholism. So that way it's not watered down. In fact, they tell us, and that we didn't read in the beginning, they tell us in the beginning that there's not one word that's been changed in the doctor's opinion. It's exactly as it was originally written in 1939. So that we can get that, we can learn exactly what they learned. It is that critical to learn this information. So to go along, as I thought, you know, coming into AA thinking, well, step 1, yeah, I'm an alcoholic. How do we get on to step 2? If you don't know what an alcoholic is, I can't concede to my innermost self unless I really know that that is a hopeless condition for me. Mm-hmm. And if you do, you know, I turn back to page 44 and look at those two questions. And if you answer yes to one or both of them, that seems to me a really good time. If you want to concede to your innermost self, might be a good time to look at yourself in the mirror and say, I suffer from a condition that prevents the normal functioning of my mind and body. What am I willing to do about it? What am I willing to do about it? That's conceding. That breaks it down. That makes sense? So, let's look into what the doctor has to say about this mind and body condition, because that's where we're going to find most of this information. And if you turn to page XXVIII, it's one of my favorite pages, all worn out in this book already. But this explains the mind and body very, very clearly. In the first paragraph, first full paragraph. Now, this is written by Dr. Silkworth. And so we all know who Dr. Silkworth is. Like, who's this doctor? Well, in the beginning of the doctor's opinion, they tell us that the alcoholic readers are going to be interested in the medical estimate of the plan of recovery described in this book. In other words, if you're sick, you probably want to know what the medical community has to offer you. What can treatment centers do? What can therapists do? But if you're sick, it's mostly medical. What does the medical community have to say? So they said, well, we got to get somebody to tell us what the medical community has. So who are we going to pick that the rest of the community is not going to pick about? Well, what does he really know, right? So who are they going to pick? Let's see his credentials. They say on page XXV, they say his credentials are, it says convincing testimony, first off, must surely come from medical men who have experience with our sufferings, must have seen us suffer, and have witnessed our return to health. Return to health. Where did we hear that before? Isn't to be recovered to be returned to a normal state of health? They must have seen us recovered. So who is it? One, he's a well-known doctor. Pretty high up there. Second, he's chief physician. That's a pretty high mark, right? Not only a chief physician, but he's a chief physician at a nationally prominent hospital. Another big check. Not only that, you know what? It's a nationally prominent hospital, and you know what they specialize in? Alcohol and drug addiction. Who are you going to go above that? That's who they picked to write this letter. So his opinion starts out back on page XXVIII, where he says, we believe, and so suggested a few years ago, and notice he says, we believe. I always like to point this out, because who is this guy? Where's he at in the ladder? He's chief physician. So when he says we, it's him and those below him. This is what they believe. He'd just say, I believe. He says, we believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy, that the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occur in the average temperate drinker. All right. First off, don't get hung up on the word, the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics. What's a chronic alcoholic? How do I know if I'm chronic? Right? That must be a class. Am I part of that subclass? Well, I had to learn what that meant. In medical terms, there's two things that happen to a person when they're sick. It's either acute or it's chronic. Acute means it's something that came on suddenly. You know, like you might get a cold or something, it comes on suddenly. Something that is chronic is something that has progressed over a period of time. Anybody have their alcoholism progress over a period of time? Yeah, that's what they mean by chronic. So don't get hung up on that word. But what he's saying is, what's wrong with our body here? He says the problem with the alcoholic body is that we have an allergy to alcohol. Anybody ever hear that before? Man, allergy to alcohol? Some people have. But to understand it took me a long time to understand. What does that mean to have an allergy to alcohol? And if you think about the common sense of that, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Like if you have an allergy to bees, you're probably not a beekeeper, right? You're probably not hanging out with bees. Yet if I'm allergic to alcohol, why is it that I would be drinking so much of it? That doesn't make any sense. The problem is that this allergy, according to the doctor, works different than most all the other allergies that we know of. When you're allergic to something, it's something you can usually see. People have a runny nose, watery eyes, sometimes it can be life-threatening where their throats swell up, hives, things like that. If the allergic person comes in contact with the allergen, you're going to see an allergic reaction. This isn't that way. This isn't something that people will see the result of it, right? But they don't see the allergic reaction, because the allergic reaction, he said, is defined as what he's calling a phenomenon of craving. What that means is when the alcoholic puts alcohol in his system, as soon as you take the first drink, if you're an alcoholic, what happens to us physically, not mentally, is that we have a physical allergic reaction beyond our mental control for another one. And when we put that second one in, We have even a stronger allergic reaction beyond our mental control to have that third one. And on and on and on. And it says that doesn't happen to normal people. And normal, by the way, because we hear that a lot too. Normal. What is normal? Normal is simply what the majority of people experience. We are not the majority of people out there. We experience this, and it tells us later in a separate class. Okay. And that kind of explains the idea of why, when I set out to have 2 or 3, did I have 20? That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? And if you're not sure if that's you, then I ask you this, the same thing I had to ask myself. Well, what's my excuse? When I said I'm only going to have 2 or 3, because my wife said if I ever have that happen again, she's throwing me out. Why did I have 20? If I had 20, then there must have been something in my mind that said, you know what? I'm finishing my 3rd, but I think I'm going to go on to 20 because I just think it's going to be worthwhile. She doesn't mean that. I can't give you an explanation that makes any kind of sense whatsoever why I had more than I intended to. And for those of you who said that that happened often, why do you think that happened? And I want you to think about this as well. Anybody have an allergy? I'm not going to point you out, but if you have allergies, you ever try controlling that allergy? For instance, if you're allergic to bees and you know that you're going to break out and your neck will swell up and it'll send you to the hospital. It happens every time. It may have only happened a couple of times, but you know it happens every time. Have you ever said, I know I got this allergy now. So I get stung this time. I'm going to use my mental control to stop the allergic reaction. It's impossible. It's our body. We have no control over that. Same as here. We have no control over this physical craving beyond our mental control. Does that make sense? So he goes on to say that these allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all. That's another important point. So if you're normally somebody who drinks hard liquor and you say, well, this is what I heard a lot. I only drink O'Doul's now. Okay. O'Doul's has a little bit of alcohol, but the argument will be, yeah, but it's not enough to get me drunk. I'd have to drink a whole case of it. And I've tried, but I've never gotten drunk. But the doctor's saying here, it will produce a physical craving that sooner or later, the time and place, as we read, will come when you are going to drink again and you're going to lose all control over the amount that you drink. Okay, so we can't have it in any form at all. What about cold medicine? Alcohol in it. I would think about that. This is an allergy. We have to understand that that's the case. That is part of conceding that we're an alcoholic. We are different. We have an allergy. Although, as we read on page 30, most of us don't want to admit that we're different than other people. Well, we are. And and what brings us to the point of conceding that fact? Enough pain. Keep trying to control it. When it brings enough pain, it'll bring you around to your conviction. We're not here to convince you of anything. You do that when you're out there drinking. And when you're convinced, you come in here, then you're ready. Then you're ready. So that's what we know about the body. Now, get this, what the doctor says, he says, once we form this habit, that's an interesting word because when we talk about a habit by definition is a repeated pattern of the mind. So now we're not talking about the body, we're talking about the mind. We keep drinking, I'm only going to have this, and I drink too much, I'm only going to have it, and I drink too much, it becomes a habit, okay? And then it says, once we form the habit, and this is kind of a pattern that happens, then we found we can't break it. So how do we try to break the pattern? We try to stop drinking. And then we find, shoot, not only can't I control the amount I take, I can't stop and stay quit. You know, a lot of us come to AA thinking, my problem is, or the question would be, why can't I stop drinking? You know what we're going to find here? That's the wrong question. The question is, why do I start drinking? That's going to be the question here. But it says we're going to try to quit. We find we can't break it. And then we're going to lose our self-confidence. Why can't I quit? Willpower isn't working. We're going to lose our reliance upon human things, treatment centers, counselors, maybe certain types of drugs we go on, maybe religion. None of these things are working. We're losing confidence in all these things, getting closer to this hopeless idea. He says the last thing that happens, and this is what brings us, most of us, if not all of us, to AA, is what the doctor says is the last thing that happens. And that is that our problems pile up on us and become astonishingly difficult to solve. Is that what brought anybody here? Problems piling up and become astonishingly difficult to solve. That's what he says happens with us. Now I want to go down to the bottom, because now we're going to talk just a little bit about the mind. We understand the body here, right? Well, let's just look at what is the resolution to that problem? If you can't control the allergy, what's the solution? Well, they tell us in between here, the solution, he says, is absolute abstinence. If you don't put the first one in, you'll never have an allergic reaction. When we recover from alcoholism, we recover our sanity. Is our sanity part of our mind or our body? We have a two-part condition, mind and body. We're recovering our sanity, step 2. We never recover from the allergy, according to the book. We will always have that allergy. We ever put it in, we're going to end up drinking more than we intend to, and on and on and on. So the solution is to not have the first one. But this is especially for new people. I want you to pay attention to this, because not only did we ask 2 questions, the doctor goes on saying with all the people, and he's seen thousands of people, he says, and not just alcoholics. What did he specialize in? Alcohol and drug addiction. He specialized in addiction. They all work the same. And we're going to see that here. And he says they all go through the same pattern. So see if you can, when we talk about comparison, see if you can compare your experience to what they're going to tell us here that all addicts go through. He says men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. The sensation is so elusive that while they admit it is injurious, but underline this, they cannot after a time differentiate the true from the false. To them, their alcoholic life seems to be the only normal one. So here's the cycle. And he starts out saying, and this, by the way, is when we're sober. And I'm not ad-libbing that. You're going to see that when we get to the end of the cycle. When we are sober as alcoholics, we are restless, irritable, and discontent. That's another thing that differentiates us from other people. The Al-Anon's back there. When you don't have a drink, are you restless, irritable, and discontent? No. Most people aren't. My wife isn't. Not at all, unless I start getting out of hand. Other than that, she lives a pretty content life. But for us, it says all the time with us alcoholics, when we're sober, we're restless, irritable, and discontent, which is the primary reason we're going to see why people keep coming to AA and going back out and coming back and going back out, because they think that sober is the answer to the problem. We're going to find sober. Sober is defined in the dictionary as not drunk, and that's it. And we're reading right here, when we're not drunk, what do we feel like? We're restless, irritable, and discontent. And you can summarize that as miserable. We're miserable when we're sober. So that's the first thing. So what does that progress to? It says, unless they can experience the sense of ease and comfort which comes at once from taking a few drinks that they see others taking with impunity. I'm miserable, and guess what I'm thinking about? The one thing that I know is going to make me feel better. That is going to be the sense of ease and comfort I get from a few drinks. Does anybody recognize that feeling? Miserable, and I want that sense of ease and comfort. Think about that now. Does that make the alcohol the problem? I'm miserable. I'm thinking of the ease and comfort from drinking. Drinking gives me the ease and comfort. That's my solution. Problem is, I'm sober and I'm miserable. We'll get back to that. So we start thinking about it, and other people don't seem to be having a problem with it. And then it says sooner or later, remember we read, the time and place will come when you drink again. So when you're sober, even in AA, or even not in AA, when you're sober, you're in between those first 2 places. You're restless, irritable, and discontent, thinking about a few drinks, and you're staying right in there until sooner or later you don't reflect on the consequence and you move to the next part. But some of us can stay there for a very, very long time. But that's where we're at. Miserable and, my God, wanting to drink, but don't want the consequences. But can't find relief for the way we feel. But it says that if you keep going on like that, you're an addict. The next thing that will happen is that we will succumb to the desire again. That means that we put the first one in. And so many do. And then what happens? We put it in, then the body takes over. The phenomenon of craving develops. So now we start drinking more than we intend to. He says we pass through the well-known stages of a spree. A spree is defined as unrestricted overindulgence. We drink more than we intend to. Next thing that happens, we emerge remorseful. There we're talking a little bit about consequences, but notice it doesn't matter what the consequences are. Did you emerge? Anybody ever emerge remorseful? Most of us emerge remorseful when we come here. We emerge remorseful. And what happens after we emerge remorseful? The last part of the cycle. We have a firm resolution. Man, I'll never do that again. I'm done. Done for good. I'm using my willpower to stay quit because I don't want those consequences anymore. And it says this is repeated over and over. So if that's the end, willpower, I'm sober. Well, now I'm getting a little restless, irritable, and discontent. And now I'm thinking about that sense of ease and comfort. But I'm saying I don't want the consequences. Over a period of time, they say sooner or later, we're going to pick it up again. And we're going to keep going through this over and over and over. But here's the question. When we have such great consequences that we know we're going to pay, why would we pick it up again? Even if we're miserable, why would we pick it up again? We know what we have to lose. Any sane mind would say, with what you have to lose, to get yourself a little ease and comfort, it's probably not worth losing your job, your kids, your spouse, and everything. It doesn't make sense. So why would we do that? So we can dig just a little bit further into this. If we go to page, by the way, if you look at page 35, the very top, it says, so we shall describe some of the mental states that precede a relapse into drinking. We're talking about what we're getting to is the insanity they're talking about in step 2, the alcoholic mind. It boils down to this. What is the thinking that precedes just before we pick up that first drink? What is it that tells us when we're using all our willpower to stop? What is that thought that happens that tells us, oh, it makes perfect sense? What is that? There's no excuse for I'm sure none of, if you're alcoholic, you have no idea why you picked it up. They tell us that too, if you're honest with yourself, you have no idea why you picked it up again. So we want to look at that. It says, that the thinking that precedes the relapse into drinking, for obviously that's the crux of the problem. So what they're stating there is we have a problem with the body, we have a problem with the mind. What's the crux of the problem? The mind. Because if we don't pick up the first one, we're not going to have the allergic reaction, right? Does that make sense? Now, so what's wrong with the mind? Let's go to page 24. This to me always stands out. This is just for me. Stands out as probably, if you know the problems of mind and body, mind and the body, and you know the crux is the mind, knowing what's wrong with our mind to me is probably the most important thing for me to understand what it means to be powerless over alcohol and why this is hopeless. They tell us here why, when we try to quit for good, we can't. Why we keep picking it up regardless of the consequence. See what they say. The fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, we have lost the power of choice and drink. In reading that, please do not go to a meeting ever again and say, I have a choice whether I drink today or not. According to this, you don't, if you're an alcoholic. We have lost the power of choice and drink because our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. That's what we're using to stay quit, by the way, is our willpower, right? We don't want the consequences. We're exerting willpower, not doing it. Problem is, it says we are unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We are without defense against that first drink. In other words, he's saying it doesn't happen all the time. You quit, you're in that state. When you quit, you're restless, irritable, and discontent. You're thinking about the ease and comfort, but you're still reflecting on the consequences and saying, no, it ain't worth it. I'm going to stay quit. I'm going to be as miserable as all get out, but I ain't picking it up. It ain't worth it, right? It's like a double-edged sword. You're kind of screwed either way, right? But I'm not going to pick it up. What it says here, if you're an alcoholic, at certain times, the time will come when you will drink again. Certain times, you're not going to reflect on the consequence. That is the only thing that breaks our will. When I use my willpower to not pick this coffee cup up, it's because I've told myself I don't want to. Whatever, maybe it was too hot and I want to wait a half an hour. And I put it down. It will not happen 5 seconds later. I'm going to pick it up again and put it in my mouth. I'm using my willpower and I remember the consequence. Not doing it in 20 minutes, right? But it's saying here that certain times we're not even going to reflect on the consequence. Didn't we read that in the case study? The guy said, it didn't even occur to me. What I learned about alcoholism didn't even come into my mind. What's wrong with me? The consequences don't even come to our mind. You can read that in Bill's story as well. The problem does not even come into our mind because what the ease and comfort that we need becomes so great that it pushes out of our mind what it is going to do to me. And all I'm going to be thinking about is what it's going to do for me. That happens to every one of us. And if you think about that, my friends, is a hopeless condition. That is what puts us beyond human aid, as they call in this book. They say that we are beyond human aid Because if I can't reflect on the consequences when I'm getting ready to pick up a drink, as he just so casually did, is your sponsor going to be there right then to say, oh, no, no, what are you doing? Don't do that. Is your counselor going to be there? Nobody. Beyond, if I can't stop me, nobody is stopping me. Therein lies the problem. So the problem, again, is not drinking. That's our solution. The problem is that we're restless, irritable, and discontent when we're sober. So the question comes down to, why are we restless and irritable and discontent? Part 2 is step 1. Our lives are unmanageable. When we're restless, irritable, and discontent, it is because our lives are unmanageable. Why are our lives unmanageable? Let's turn to page 62. I promise I'm getting close to the end of this. Page 62, first full paragraph. This may be the second most important sentence to me in this book. First full paragraph says, selfishness and self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. The root of our troubles is not alcohol. The root of our restless, irritable, and discontentedness is selfishness and self-centeredness. You want to break that cycle of drinking that we read about in the doctor's opinion? The way you do that is you get rid of part 1. If I can be sober and happy, I will never be thinking about the sense of ease and comfort of anything because I already have it. You break the whole cycle. But see, living a life based on selfishness and self-centeredness and exerting our will on other people to do what we want and trying to get everything we can out of life creates misery. I'm not going to get into all that this week, but that creates a restless, irritable, and discontentedness. The problem is selfishness, self-centeredness. It says, middle of the page down there, above everything we do, we alcoholics must get rid of this selfishness. We must or it kills us, and God makes that possible. It doesn't say we must get rid of the alcohol. Because we must get rid of selfishness, or that will kill us, and God will make that possible. And the next part is, there often seems no way of entirely getting rid of this selfishness without his aid. So we're beyond human aid. So where are we going to get aid? It's going to have to come from this God thing that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. The last things I want to turn to is page 24, back where we were. And I want to look at the bottom of the page. Top of the page, first paragraph is what we read is what's wrong with us. We don't reflect on the consequence, right? So the first thing they say at the last paragraph says, when this sort of thinking, the thinking they're talking about is what we just read, where we don't reflect on the consequence at certain times when we pick it up. It says, when that sort of thinking is fully established in an individual with alcoholic tendencies, he has probably placed himself beyond human aid. And unless locked up, may die or go permanently insane. So that's kind of like door number 1 or door number 2, right? We're beyond human aid. The next thing I want to look at is page 64. Got 2 more little pieces here. I'm going to go down to the last paragraph, 64. Now, so far we've read with the alcoholic illness, we have a problem with the mind, we have a problem with the body. And here we're talking about something about the whole center of it has to do with selfishness. Well, it's a threefold illness. That's what we're going to find here. Again, they bury it in page 64, but that's where it is. It says here, 3 lines down in the last paragraph. Actually, look at that. We'll just read the whole thing. Last paragraph. Resentment's number 1 offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything. Resentment is part of selfishness, self-centeredness. It destroys more alcoholics than anything. From its stem all forms of spiritual disease. The only time you see the word disease in the first portion of this book is spiritual disease. So get this. We've not only been physically and mentally ill, which is all we've been talking about. It says now we have also been spiritually sick. Third prong, selfishness, unmanageable life, restless, irritable, and discontent. So how do we stop this whole thing? We got 3 parts of an illness. We got an allergy, we got this mental insanity, and we have the spiritual thing. Here's the answer. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. When the spiritual, we're going to face this through the spiritual malady, which is why we do steps 4 through 9. They have nothing to do with drinking. They have nothing to do with an allergy. They have everything to do with our character defects, our selfishness, self-centeredness that we need to get rid of. So that is the answer. That is the answer. So I want to lastly hit page 25, because this sums it up, especially for new people. You know the problem, you know a little bit about the solutions to have the spiritual deal. It says here, if you're as seriously as alcoholic as we were, we believe there's no middle of the road solution. We were in a position where life was becoming impossible. And if we had passed into the region that we just read on the other page, from where there is no return through human aid, we had but two alternatives, door number one, door number two. One was to go on to the bitter end, blocking out the consciousness of our intolerable situation as best we could. And the other is to accept. When we get into accept, that's always about the solution in this book. The other is to accept spiritual help, which is what we'll get into next week.